So far, we've been talking mostly about objects, but I'd like to take a little detour to talk about data types in JavaScript. The purpose of this video will be to give you some vocabulary about data types and give you a better understanding of the various types and how they behave. I've declared a couple of variables that we can play with that are of different types. The first thing to point out is that JavaScript uses something called dynamic typing. This means that we don't need to declare the type of a variable, we just declare the variable, and JavaScript figures out the type automatically based on the value. So over here I've created a couple of variables which you might normally see with the var keyword, but to create a global variable I'm just omitting that var keyword. These are also called identifiers. So the name of the variable is an identifier, and we call it an identifier because it identifies a particular value. So in this case, I have an identifier called myString, and its value is this string here of myString. And same thing with my number, and here's the actual value of 5. And with my Boolean, it's true, and so on. Now, if you're coming from a class-based language, you're probably used to declaring a type for the variable. But in JavaScript, we don't have to do that. So notice here that my string is assigned to this string value, but we could just as easily reassign it to a number or a Boolean, and that would be just fine. Next, let's look at the various types that exist in JavaScript. There's basically two types, or two categories for types. One is called a primitive, and the other has been what we've been working with all along, an object. And there's various types of both of these big categories of types, primitives and objects. So let's start off with primitives. Here's an example of all of the various primitive types in JavaScript right here. You can think of a primitive as a simple value, like a number or a true, false, null, or undefined. You might be a little bit surprised to find that a string is also a primitive in JavaScript, which is unlike some other class-based languages like Java. Now, one of the key features of primitive types is that they're immutable. So let me write that down. They're immutable. What that means is that once we've created a primitive type, like we have here or here, we can't change it. We can reassign the variable, but we can't actually change the value. So let me give you an example of that. I'm going to come over to the console and type myString so we can see it. And one of the things you can do with strings is you can look at the individual characters in the string. And so what I'm doing here is saying, show me the first character in the string, and it's M. Now, if this were mutable, or we could change it, I could take this first character and assign it to something different. Let's just say A. Now, instead of myString, it should read AY space string. But if I take a look at the string, you can see it hasn't actually been changed because the value is immutable. The second thing to note about primitive types is we typically create them simply by assigning. So when you see this equals sign here, sometimes I'll use this terminology, assigning. And that means that we're assigning this value here to this variable or identifier called myString. And so we'll create the primitive type simply in line by assigning it to some variable. Next up, let me show you how to get the type of a particular variable. In the console on the right, I'm going to use the type of operator and pass the name of the variable. And what I get back is the type of the value. So in this case, myString's value is a string. Now notice I could reassign myString to something else, like a number. And now if I say type of myString, it says that the type is a number. And we can apply the type of operator to all the various primitive types. Next up, let's look at objects. So the first object variable that I have here is called myObject, and I've created a new object literal and assigned it to this myObject variable. Now objects behave a little bit differently. They are mutable, which means we can change them after they've been created. A simple way to demonstrate that is let's just add a new property to this object. And now when I inspect the object, you can see that it has a new property. So in other words, we were able to mutate the object or change it. Let's look at some other types of object-like values. We'll look at array next. So an array behaves very similarly to an object. And so if I take a look at the myArray object or myArray variable, you can see it's been assigned to an array. But if I put it inside of a console dir and we inspect it, you'll see that it looks very similar to an object. And so it has properties like length, and it has a prototype pointer that points up to a prototype object. Let's look at some other types of object-like values. We'll look at array next. So an array behaves very similarly to an object. And so if I take a look at the myArray object or myArray variable, you can see it's been assigned to an array. But if I put it inside of a console dir and we inspect it, you'll see that it looks very similar to an object. And so it has properties like length, and it has a prototype pointer that points up to a prototype object. In fact, the items that we're adding to the array at specific indices are actually created as properties, and so you can see the 0 property and the 1 property. So an array acts just like a regular object, except that it has some methods on it that are specific to arrays, and we're also able to access values at specific indices. Next up, let's take a look at functions. Functions are just like objects as well. So if I take a look at the myFunction variable, it looks like a function in the console, but if I console dir myFunction, we can again drill into it and see that it has its own properties. And it has a prototype pointer that points up to a prototype for functions. So I can add properties to this object just like we did before. And we can take a look at the new property by drilling into the object. So one of the differences between functions and regular objects is that with functions we can call them. And they also have some methods on them like call and apply that are specific to function objects. But the great thing about functions is we can treat their values just like objects, which can be passed around in our applications. Now, if I do a type of operator on the myFunction variable, you'll see that we get back that it's of type function. Finally, in the last example, I'm creating a date object using the new operator. You've already seen how constructor functions work, and this particular constructor function here is called a native constructor function, and we'll look at that specifically in the native constructor function video. But I want to show you that we've created a new object here of type date, and it looks and acts very similar to a regular object, except that it has some methods on it that are specific to dates. So let's take a look at this object and drill into it. And notice it has properties, and it has a prototype property, which points up to the date prototype. And so we have some methods available to dates that we don't have on other objects. In this video, we looked at some concepts around data types, and I introduced some vocabulary. We started off by looking at how JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. Then we looked at the difference between a primitive type and an object type. And we talked about the idea of mutable versus immutable values.